recording, Lily. What questions do you have?
What were your mommy and daddy like?
Oh, my mommy and daddy. Well, my daddy was a very, very hard-working man. His name was William S., which stands for Smith, Owen. And he was born in Southern Virginia in a place called Pittsylvania County on a tobacco farm. And he learned how to work very hard at a very, very young age. And my mother also grew up on a tobacco farm only about 10 miles away from where my father was born. And she was from a large family too. There were 6 girls in her family and 4 boys. And they had lots of work to do around the house. They grew all of their own vegetables and canned their vegetables and washed their own clothes, made their own soap, just like my father and his family did. There was a lot of work to be done on a farm. Just like that book we read about Kit Kitteridge, the time that she grew up was in the Great Depression. Well, my parents grew up in the Great Depression too, so they had to work very, very hard on the farm. They had their own pigs, their own chickens, their own cows, their own horses. And they were very, very nice people, and they always took me to church, and I always enjoyed going to church and all of the young people's groups that we went to, so that I learned a lot about Bible stories and the right way to act and behave when I was a little girl and when I grew up. Then I had 2 brothers. My older brother Tommy was 2.5 years older than I was. Uncle Tommy's the one that comes to see you in the fall with his wife Linda when they're on their way up to Maine to hunt grouse for, I guess, about 6 weeks. And he usually kills about 200 grouse. That's a lot. And he brings them down to where he lives, and he gives some to other people, and he has several big dinners and serves this wonderful grouse, and all the people just enjoy the grouse dinners that he gives for them. And I also have a younger brother named Gene Frederick, and Gene is 12 years younger than I am. And you know what? He lives in the very house that my mother and my father, actually it was only my mother that lived there, because my father had died by the time my mother built this house. So my 2 brothers still live near where I grew up. So that's a very long answer to a very short question.
What did you do for Halloween?
Oh, well, when I was growing up, Halloween was not nearly as big a celebration as it is now. So when I was a little girl, about the only thing we did for Halloween was have a little party at school. And the mother of one of the children in the class always made these special sugar cookies for any kind of special occasion. And that's what we always looked forward to, were those little sweet cookies that she made. But as I got older, around 12 or 13 or 14 years old, we'd all get together, a group of us from our youth group at church, and we would go trick-or-treating for UNICEF. And we didn't dress up in costumes, but we went around to people's houses and asked them for money for UNICEF. And UNICEF is an organization that is worldwide that helps children in need. So that's what we did for Halloween.
Did you ever play dress-up growing up?
Oh, yes, all the time. But you know what my favorite dress-up was?
What?
And my friends. Well, when we were growing up, we watched a lot of westerns on TV. Hopalong Cassidy, The Lone Ranger, The Cisco Kid, and you know, cowboys dressed up in their cowboy hat, and they had on their spurs and their chaps and their western attire. And so that's how we would dress up, and we'd go down in the woods my best friend Linda Grant and her sister Patsy, and we would play cowboys and Indians for hours and hours and hours on end. And our horses would be a stick that we would put between our legs and pretend that we were riding a horse.
So like you went like this, get up,
Exactly.
get up, get up.
Exactly. And then we would use for guns, our fingers, or a stick. And we were always the good guys. We always played the good guys. And we always captured the bad guys. And
Well, it's kindergarten like for you.
oh, you're not going to believe this, but that was so long ago, we didn't even have kindergarten.
Oh.
No kindergarten. No preschool. No kindergarten.
No first grade.
Oh yes, we had first grade. And I'll tell you what, my teacher in first grade was named Mrs. Thatcher. And she was so pretty. And she was so beautiful. She was the prettiest teacher at school. And she was young. And I liked her. I loved Mrs. Thatcher. And she liked me. And she let me tell stories to the whole class when I was in first grade. I had an older cousin named Melba. And my older cousin, who was in high school, would tell me and my brother stories when we came to her house. And when I went to school, I would tell the stories to the other children. And sometimes, quite often, when we had some extra time at the end of the day, Mrs. Thatcher would say, Betty Ruth, because that was what everybody called me. Betty is my first name. Ruth is my middle name because I was named after my mother, who was named Ruth. So she'd say, Betty Ruth, do you want to tell us a story today? And I would say, oh, yes. And I would stand up in front of the class and I would repeat some of the stories that my older cousin had told me. And you know what?
What?
They were always scary stories. Always scary stories.
Do you have any pets? Did you have any?
Oh, yes. I had a pet. My brother and I had, our first dog was called Snowball, and it was an Eskimo Spitz, a very white dog, white as snow, and the tail curled right over its back, just like that. And we loved that dog so much, but we lived right near a busy road, and our dog was always running in the road. And one day she got hit. So that made us very sad. But my daddy went to his brother's house and got us 2 more dogs. And my brother's dog was named Hot Dog because he looked just like a hot dog. Looked exactly like a hot dog with 4 legs and a tail. So that's why my brother named him Hot Dog. So since my brother named his dog something you ate, like a hot dog, then I tried to think of some piece of food that you would eat to name my dog. So my dog ended up being named Tootsie Roll. But we called her Tootsie for short. So my dog was Tootsie and Hot Dog. So we had those. So those dogs lived a very long time. My dog, you've seen your Aunt Elizabeth's dog, haven't you? Kiki, Kinkajou.
Yeah.
You saw Kinkajou? Well, that's what Tootsie looked like. My Tootsie looked almost exactly like Kinky does, only it was a slightly larger dog. So I had that dog until I went to college. So they were just about my favorite friends growing up. They went with me everywhere when I rode my bike down the hill to see my friend Linda, and they were always there with me. And I'd catch tadpoles in the creek and pretend they were my friends too and watch them turn into frogs. When you catch tadpoles and watch them turn into frogs. So.
Were you the first person in your family to go to college?
I sure was. I sure was. Because my brother decided he wanted to go to work when he got out of high school, even though his teachers and everybody told him he should go to college. It was when my father was really, really sick, and he decided that we needed him more at home, that his mother needed him more at home. So he went to work in Dan River cotton mills, which are no longer there. They've all moved overseas into third world countries now.
Were you nervous going away?
Yes, a little bit anxious to go away to college, but I had two friends that lived very close to me, Linda Grant and Ann Carter, and we all went to the same college. We all went to Radford College, and the reason we all went there together was so that our parents could take turns driving us there and back. And one of the girls, Ann Carter, didn't have a father, and her mother couldn't drive, so they couldn't take turns taking us to college. So either Linda's father, Mr. Grant, or my mother, because my father was dead at this point, the two of them would take turns taking all three of us to college, which took about 3 hours then, and it was over very mountainous roads, very, very dangerous roads in the wintertime. And one time when my mother was taking us back, it was snowing and ice, and our car, the front wheels just slid right off the road going down a steep embankment, and our car was sitting just like this, and all of a sudden it just stopped, and my mother, who was behind the wheel of the car, said, "God help us." And that's when the car stopped, right then, as the wheels were going right over the back. So she very calmly put the gear shift in reverse, and very slowly, slowly, slowly the car rolled back on the road, and we got back on the right way to go to college, and we got there safe and sound.
How old were you when you flew on an airplane the first time?
When I went on an airplane for the first time was not until I was teaching school, after I had been to high school, after I had been to college, and when I was teaching in Leesburg. A friend of mine and I went over to the airport called Godfrey Field, and we used to watch the airplanes, the private planes take off and land. And my friend and I were over there one day, and this man walked up to us, and he said, we didn't know who he was. He was just a stranger to us. He said, "Would you like to go for a ride in my airplane?" And we said, "Sure, why not?" So my friend and I got on this private little plane with a stranger. We had no idea who he was, and he flew us all over Leesburg and the surrounding areas and pointed out all the points of interest to us. And while I was on that plane, I started thinking, maybe this was not such a smart thing to do, to get on a plane with somebody that I didn't know who he was. Just like you would never get in a car and go with somebody that you don't know. That's not very smart, is it? But I learned later that this man did this all the time, and that he was a very prominent businessman in Leesburg. And he just enjoyed taking people up in his plane. So it turned out to be a very good thing. And that was my first airplane ride in any kind of a plane. But since then, I have had probably 100 airline flights to many, many different countries. Turkey, India, Egypt.
China?
No, I haven't been to China, but Grandpa's been, and he's going back again this year. But we are going to Germany this year. But I've been to Germany about 4 or 5 times before. But I'm still looking forward to going to Hamburg this year. And I'll be going to Albuquerque to see your...
Will you get a stuffed there?
Will I get what?
Stuffed there to remind you, like souvenirs?
Oh, good question.
I didn't get the question.
Will you get stuff there, souvenirs, to remind you?
Oh, I always get souvenirs wherever I go. And I always send you a souvenir too, don't I? What's the souvenir I always send you?
A postcard.
A postcard. That's the best souvenir of all.
What's the favorite place that you've been?
My favorite place. I would have to say that at least one of my favorite places was Hawaii. We went there 21 years ago for our 20th anniversary. Grandpa and I went there for our 20th anniversary when his best friend, Jimmy Hall, was getting married on the top of Diamond Head, which is a very popular place for weddings over there. And Daddy, your daddy, and Elizabeth and William stayed home, and our friend's daughter, Margot Thompson, kept them. It was the year Elizabeth graduated from high school in 1988. But the reason I liked Hawaii so much is it was a tropical paradise. There were so many beautiful birds, and there were such gorgeous colors and flowers that I had never seen before. It was just like paradise. Sort of like what I think heaven might be like. Just beautiful. The sky was beautiful. The sands were beautiful. Beautiful birds. It was just the prettiest place I think I've ever been.
What was your birthday like?
Oh my goodness. My birthday, I was born in May. May, the merry month of May. May the 12th, actually. And every year on my birthday, it was just about the same time that blackberry season was in. And I like to pick blackberries. So every year my mother would say, Betty, what do you want for what kind of cake do you want for your birthday? And I would say, I don't want a cake for my birthday. I just want a blackberry pie. So she would say, go out, pick the blackberries, and I'll make you a blackberry pie. So every year for my birthday, I had a blackberry pie instead of a cake. And that's just about my favorite pie, even today.
What presents would you get?
Well, when I was growing up, we weren't big on presents. The pie was just about my only present for my birthday.
What about for Christmas?
Oh, for Christmas. Well, for Christmas, it was kind of a special time because instead of stockings, my parents would put out a shoebox. And the shoebox is what Santa Claus would fill up with all kinds of little treats, little goodies, apples, oranges, nuts, little toys and things. And my two brothers, Tommy and Gene, and I would each have our very own shoebox under the Christmas tree. One year I remember I got a watch, and I was so very excited because I finally got a watch of my very own. And I could, of course, tell time by then. And you know what? I still have that watch. Even though it's broken, I still have it. It was a Bulova, which is a very popular brand back then, and they still make Bulova today. And I always wanted a bicycle, but my parents never got me one because they said, you can just ride your brother's. So Tommy, my brother, and I shared the bicycle. We'd take turns riding it up and down the dirt road. And sometimes there was so much loose gravel on the road that the bicycle would slip out from under me, and I would fall and scrape my knee. And the worst fall I ever had was when I left my friend Linda's house, and one of their chickens ran right across the road in front of my bicycle, and bicycle tumbled over, I tumbled over, scratched my elbow, scraped my knees, and I was banged up pretty bad. I don't think I could ride the bicycle to the house. I had to push it and walk back to the house myself. But that's the first time that the chicken had ever run out in front of my bicycle. But that wasn't as bad as the time I was riding my neighbor's, Linda Grant's father's horse called Old Dan. Old Dan was as big as a percheron, massive feet, massive head. He was so strong he could pull anything. But I wanted to ride Big Dan home for lunch one day after stringing leaves at the tobacco barn. So he put me up on Big Old Dan. And you know what Big Old Dan started doing?
What?
Running. And when he was running, I was just bouncing up and down because I was just a little thing, until he just bounced me right off, right onto the hard ground. And I was stunned for a minute and didn't realize what had happened until Mr. Grant walked over and helped me get up. And I said, I want to get back on Dan. And he said, no, Betty Ruth, I don't think you better get back on old Dan right now. So we just walked on down the road for lunch.
But what did you do about your big scrapes?
Well, I went home and I washed them off, and we put a Band-Aid on them, and eventually they healed up, and I'm okay now. I have a few scars, but they're not from falling.
What are they from?
Oh, well, you see this scar here? I have about an inch or longer scar right here on my chin. Well, when I was about the same age as Evie right now, I had this little freckle come up right here on my chin, about the size of a head of a pin. And my mother said she used to try to wash it off. She thought it was dirt, and it wouldn't come off. Instead, it just kept growing and growing and growing until it got to be the size of my thumb. This big, brown, raised mole right here on my chin. And then you know what it started doing?
What?
It started growing hairs just like your head. And this mole had hairs that grew out of it. And it was very strange looking. And it was raised off the skin about a 1/16 of an inch. Well, it was not very funny to me when I was a little girl because everybody looked at me like I was a freak for years. So, when I was 12 years old, my parents decided it was time for it to come out because they thought I had lived a life of a freak for long enough. So, I went to the hospital and the doctors cut it out. They put me to sleep first so I couldn't feel it, and then they took it off, and then they stitched it together with something like thread and left it on there for a couple of weeks and then took it out. And so that's how I have been marked as Christ owned forever with my permanent scar that nobody else has, right where I have it. And you know, I've only seen one other person with this type of mole on her face, and hers was right here on her cheek. And she was somebody, a stranger I met in a store. And I walked right up to her and I told her all about my special mole, and I showed her my special scar. And I told her she could have one too, just by taking her mole, having her mole taken off her face right here. And then they would stitch it up and she would have just a little scar like I have instead of a big black mole growing hairs. I'm not sure I can top that one, Eddie.